So I'm Canada 2020's deep thinker, and if you knew me, you'd laugh harder at that. Three things. Largely, I think if you read a lot of the wrap-up pieces on year one of the Trudeau government, you'll sort of get some general consensus, some B+, A-, 8 out of 10 letter grades or number grades on performance, and I think generally the public opinion polling kind of bears that out if that's the metric that you want to use. Three reasons why, or three things that sort of explain that. I think, number one, I think honestly is just a study in straight contrasts. Regardless of your politics, regardless of the policy areas that you sort of care about, there's a governing style and there's an openness that stands in really stark contrast to the 10 years previous. People generally seem to like that, and I think that that's actually a fairly intentional effort on the part of this government, and I think we should sort of expect to see more of that in the future, sort of a commitment to openness, transparency, consultations, roundtables, various shapes of tables that people gather around. The second, I think I would sort of say is, following through on a lot of, not all of, or in the process of, but following through on some key campaign promises that voters seem to actually really, really care about and put them in office to actually follow through on. So spending on infrastructure. This is a government that believes that government can play an impactful role in people's lives. They're rather Keynesian in their thinking. We're in this grand Keynesian experiment right now that think that we can actually boost growth in the short term. So that's what we're sort of dealing with right now. And I'd say sort of the third thing would be, a real commitment to and a real attention to international reputation. Jen, I think, said it best that, it matters that people are coming to Canada. And it matters, I think, because, Canada's actually reasserting itself on the world stage. It's not an accident that, the Paris climate deal was one of the first major things that we really sort of pushed for. It sent a really strong message. Again, it was a study in contrast, but actually it also really mattered. It really mattered to this government. I think matters to, like Rick said, getting to the end of that carbon tunnel. What we see is a lot of echoing of a lot of the messaging here at home abroad. Because it's 2016, Jen, you were interviewing the PM and Mayor Khan, the Mayor of London, on our stage, and Mayor Khan made a commitment, a similar commitment in his, I think it was his deputy mayor roles for having parity because it's 2016. That matters on the international stage. This is a young government. It's an ambitious government. It went from like 34 seats to 186 or 184, wherever we are now. And a lot of those were political novices, people that weren't in political office before. That is doubly so for the staff around it. And it's got a very ambitious agenda, and it's got very ambitious plans. And it's going to lean heavily on, this is sort of, we've all sort of talked about like, yes, but. So this is my big, this is the but for me is, the public service not being actually able to deliver on a lot of the big ambitious problems or challenges that have been put forth. And that's, a problem that's been persistent for, I think, probably the past 10 years or plus. So that, I think, the delivering on it is the next stage. So thanks very much.
Thanks. Come over there.
Yeah, I'll take care of you.
Where's this?
Back where you want.
Just stay right where you are. Perfect. Okay. All right. We're back?
Yep.
All right, got a few. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, Andrew, and hello to old friends. Andrew said 3 thoughts in 3 minutes and make them deep, which is a little bit contradictory.
And entertaining.
And entertaining. Okay, so I think I can do the entertaining. I'm not sure I can do the deep. First thing I would mention, which has been alluded to, is I think the government's done a very good job for itself. The Prime Minister has done a very good job for himself on the whole question of tone and style, and I don't really mean that in a pejorative way, although sometimes people put it that way. The sunny days notion. Canadians were well and truly ready for that after the dark ages of the prior government. But there's more to it than that. The inclusiveness, the gender balance, the sense of accessibility and openness, and also flexibility on public issues. These are good reflexes, I think, around government. And the government's doing a good job of presenting that part of itself to the public, or that attitude to the public, and I think that stands it in good stead. The only time I really felt that was slipping was in the period of the assisted dying legislation, where I thought the government dug in deep and was resistant to lots of advice, which I found puzzlingly out of character. Second, I would mention, but basically my note on the tone and style in a meaningful way is it's a positive for the government, and I think will continue to be if they stick to that. Secondly, there's the fiscal policy side of things, the deficit, the economy. I think the government has got to be careful what it gets into here. You know, we spent the 70s and 80s learning the lesson that you can't spend your way to prosperity. You can spend your way to a big debt problem and really constrain fiscal options. We're nowhere near that kind of situation today because we've had 20 years of relative fiscal prudence by both parties in government. But you know, if you do just keep throwing money at a problem of what you perceive to be an underperforming economy, it's not clear that you can throw enough money at a $1.7 trillion economy to turn around that ship, other than really kind of marginally. Particularly when you consider that you know, we have these things called automatic stabilizers, which already do produce deficits when the economy shrinks. You know, employment claims go up, assistance spending goes up, tax revenue goes down. These are the normal ways that the economy sort of, you know, the fiscal situation sort of addresses itself. And the government is in a situation where it's layering on additional spending. The infrastructure part, I think, is uncontroversial. But if you keep throwing money at a weak economy and it keeps not responding and it gives you a bigger and bigger deficit in return, you can get into a cyclically reinforcing kind of problem. We're not there yet, but the government is already facing deficits that are bigger, significantly bigger than were promised, and for longer than was promised. And it's not yet clear. It may become clear. The economy will strengthen at some point in time. The American economy is doing better than people were expecting. So things will improve there. So probably this problem will resolve itself. But I think the government needs to be careful not just to dig the kind of hole that we dug for ourselves as a country back in the 70s and 80s. Lastly, I would mention, and Rick alluded to it, broken promises. The promise gap, the expectations gap, climate change, First Nations, federal-provincial relations, C-51. There's a long, long list of things that were promised there, a long list of things people thought they heard were promises. When the provinces think, when you say, we're going to have an era of better federal-provincial relations, they think that means more money for the provinces, even if that's not what you actually said. So I think that, you know, 3 years out from the election, the government's obviously in terrific shape. Where do they get to in terms of promises and the perception of promises being kept versus broken 2 or 3 years from now? I think that will be a big factor in terms of the next election. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rick. And before I start, before my clock starts ticking, can I just remind people that there are books at the back written by the book on Trudeau by Huguette Young and the Harper Factor by Jennifer. They're both available on sale at the back of the room. And by the way, if you're tweeting, please do tweet. It's hashtag Pearson Year 1. This is where I start. Okay, 3 quick points that I would add, and Rick, I agree. I don't know who came up with this idea of
Which Rick?
Well, you. 3 minutes, 3 ideas. Crazy idea. Anyhow, my first point is what some of the others have alluded to, and that is the change of tenor in governing, but it also applies to the country. I think what we've seen, I would call the way the government has run the first year has been a year of catharsis, where it's been a cathartic year where we've moved away from the acrimonious politics of the previous decade and really changed the way politics is done. And I think that has an important way, it has an important reflection on government. The previous government ran as if it was against government. The opposition parties were against government. And so nobody was for government. And for those of us who believe that government can be a place, can be an element of good for the country, this was not a good situation in the past. So having a government that believes in government, I think, is important. And I think you'll see across the parties a much more harmonious approach. There have been a couple of motions in the past 2 weeks that have come from the opposition, supported by the government on major issues. One on immigration for Yazidis, and the other one on First Nations child welfare. Both motions that came from the government, and I hope there's more of that kind of thing happening. The second thing I want to suggest that is major and different is the resetting of the relationship between the government and Indigenous peoples. In a manner which I think is actually constitutional, and in a manner that most of us did not learn about in school. And I think it's a major resetting of that relationship that will have considerable effect. And I think really it's a situation where we're recognizing what Canadian history is about, and that some people have more rights than others, and that's okay. That's the way this country was formed, and that's the history of this country. The third point I'm going to make, and I know I should have kept that note out. Yes, sorry, decorum in the House of Commons. I would call this the Green Party approach to decorum in question period. So when the Green Party leader gets up to ask a question, her caucus doesn't get up and applaud her. They don't heckle. They don't shout. It took 5 years, but the Liberals have followed this approach. So you see now in question period, it's really a huge change. Where when the Liberals get up to answer questions, or if any of them are asking questions, they don't actually applaud. They don't heckle. This is a huge change because question period is the center point of the House of Commons and how politics runs. And I think you're getting a different view of this. I would urge those of you who have connections to the other parties to urge the other parties to do likewise, because at this point you still have a situation where the Conservatives get up and ask a question. There's lots of hooting and hollering and applause, and then the government answers. It's sort of like there's a festival going on one side and a funeral going on the other side. I think, though, for the sake of politics, we're better off if everybody tones it down, and I think that change is a huge change. Interestingly, it came from the backbench and not from the leadership of the Liberal Party. But I think it means a change in another part of change in the tone of politics. And I hope that it becomes the mainstay in the way that we do politics in the House of Commons on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. You all were very disciplined in your time, and I think you took Andrew's instructions very much to heart. You've got, well, you made her job very easy, I think, all of you. You had a wide array of views here. There must be some questions in the audience. Isabel.
I have a question.